Power makes men arrogant, but arrogance makes them blind. Lorenzo Rossi learned this the hard way when he publicly mocked a woman for her size at Chicago's most exclusive gala. He thought he was untouchable. He didn't know the woman he humiliated owned the very ground he walked on. Champagne flowed like water beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astor Hotel. It was the night of the Sapphire Ball, an annual charity gala that served as a glittering facade for Chicago's most powerful figures to conduct their most shadowy business. Among the politicians, tech moguls, and old money socialites stood Lorenzo Rossi. At 32, Lorenzo was the undisputed head of the Rossi syndicate. He was a man carved from marble and ruthlessness, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue Brioni suit that cost more than a luxury car. He was obsessed with aesthetics control and perfection. To Lorenzo, the world was divided into predators, and prey the flawless and the flawed. Surrounded by his inner circle, his heavily armed but sharply dressed underboss Matteo and his consigliere, Vincent Lorenzo held court near the grand staircase. He was in the middle of intimidating a local alderman into signing over a lucrative zoning permit when the incident occurred. Charlotte Montgomery was not the type of woman who usually frequented the center of such venomous social circles, though she belonged in this room more than anyone else. Charlotte was a heavy-set woman, unapologetically fat, with soft, generous curves that she never tried to hide. Tonight she wore a custom deep emerald gown that draped elegantly over her full figure. Her dark hair pinned up in a complex twist, exposing a diamond necklace that caught the light like fire. She was entirely comfortable in her own skin, possessing a quiet, unshakable dignity. She was walking past the grand staircase, reviewing an encrypted message on her phone, when a drunk socialite violently backed into her. The sudden impact sent Charlotte stumbling forward. She tried to catch her balance, her hand reaching out instinctively, but instead of finding a railing, she collided squarely with Lorenzo Rossi. The glass of dark red Pinot Noir in Charlotte's hand splashed directly onto the lapel of Lorenzo's immaculate midnight blue suit. The immediate silence that fell over Lorenzo's circle was deafening. The alderman took a terrified step back. Matteo and Vincent stiffened their hands, drifting instinctively toward the inside of their jackets. Lorenzo looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his silk lapel, and then his cold, dark eyes snapped up to meet Charlotte's. "I am so incredibly sorry," Charlotte said immediately, her voice calm and even devoid of the panic most people exhibited when they crossed a Mafia boss. She reached into her clutch for a silk handkerchief. "Someone bumped into me from behind. Please send the cleaning bill to... Don't touch me." Lorenzo snapped his voice, a low, venomous hiss that carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom floor. He slapped her hand away. Charlotte blinked her hand, freezing in midair, but she did not flinch. "Excuse me." Lorenzo's vanity was pierced, and in front of an audience, his cruelty was a reflex. He looked her up and down, his gaze dripping with theatrical disgust. He took in her full figure, her soft waist, and the emerald fabric of her dress, and decided to make an example of her to entertain his peers. "Are you blind, or just too busy scanning the room for the dessert buffet to watch where you're rolling?" Lorenzo mocked his voice, raising just enough so the surrounding crowd could hear. A few cruel titters broke out from the socialites standing nearby. Matteo smirked. Charlotte's eyes hardened, the warmth completely draining from her expression. "It was an accident, Mr. Rossi. There is no need for insults." "An accident," Lorenzo scoffed, stepping closer using his height to try and intimidate her. "You took up half the aisle waddling over here. Next time you decide to squeeze yourself into a dress and pretend you belong at an event like this, do the rest of us a favor and stay in the freight elevator. You're a liability to anyone wearing decent clothing." The outright body-shaming delivered with such vicious precision by one of the city's most feared men caused gasps to ripple through the crowd. Humiliation burned in the air, thick and suffocating. People stared, waiting for the heavy-set woman to burst into tears, to flee the room in shame, to crumble under the weight of the Mafia boss's public degradation. But Charlotte didn't cry. She did not look away. She stood her ground, her posture immaculate, her breathing steady. The air around her seemed to drop 10 degrees. She looked at the stain on his suit, then looked directly into Lorenzo's dark, arrogant eyes. Her gaze was completely devoid of fear. It was the look a scientist might give a particularly annoying insect before swatting it. A stain on a suit can be dry cleaned. Mr. Rossi. Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that only he and his immediate circle could hear. But a stain on your judgment that is permanent. You are a very small man in a very expensive suit, and you will find that this spilled wine is the absolute least of your losses tonight. Lorenzo let out a harsh, barking laugh, masking a sudden, inexplicable shiver that ran down his spine at her tone. "Are you threatening me, sweetheart? Do you even know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, Lorenzo." Charlotte replied smoothly, not using his title. "The question is, do you know who I am?" Before Lorenzo could respond, Charlotte turned on her heel. Despite her size, she moved with a terrifying, undeniable grace, parting the crowd of gawking onlookers like the Red Sea. She didn't look back. "Stupid cow," Lorenzo muttered, dabbing at his suit with a napkin, trying to brush off the bizarre encounter. "Matteo, get the car. The night is ruined." He thought that was the end of it. He thought he had merely humiliated a clumsy, heavy-set woman who didn't belong in his world. He had no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant. 72 hours later, Lorenzo Rossi was not thinking about the woman in the emerald dress. He was staring at a violently red balance sheet in his heavily fortified penthouse office, feeling a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His empire was bleeding out, and he didn't know who was holding the knife. It started at the port of Chicago. The Rossi Syndicate's entire smuggling operation, the lifeblood of their illegal weapons and imported luxury goods trade, relied on Dock 44. For 5 years, Lorenzo had paid a massive tribute to the Montgomery shipping conglomerate, an ancient, untouchable old money syndicate that controlled the maritime infrastructure. The Montgomerys were ghosts. They didn't do street violence. They owned the streets. They owned the unions, the judges, the federal inspectors, and the massive cargo ships. On Monday morning, 4 of Lorenzo's cargo containers, holding $20 million in untraceable assets, were seized by federal agents. By Tuesday, the dock workers' union went on an unannounced strike, but only for ships carrying Rossi-affiliated cargo. His legal front businesses, a chain of high-end restaurants and luxury car dealerships, were suddenly raided by health inspectors, and the IRS simultaneously. By Wednesday afternoon, Lorenzo's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland were frozen. The bank managers gave no explanation, only stammering apologies before hanging up. "Talk to me, Matteo," Lorenzo roared, slamming his fist onto his mahogany desk. The sharp pain in his knuckles did nothing to quell his rising panic. How the hell does 20 million disappear? How does the IRS get a warrant in 2 hours? We pay off half the judges in this city. Matteo looked pale, his usually slicked-back hair slightly disheveled. He swallowed hard. "Boss, it's not the feds. I mean, it is, but they're just the weapon. Somebody pulled their leash. I got off the phone with Arthur Pendleton." Lorenzo's eyes widened. Arthur Pendleton was the supreme middleman, the only known liaison between the street-level mafias like the Rossis and the untouchable elites of the Montgomery Syndicate. And what did Arthur say? "Did we miss a tribute payment?" Lorenzo demanded. "Arthur is terrified, boss," Matteo whispered. He said the Montgomery family has completely blacklisted us. The order came from the absolute top, from the apex. Lorenzo felt the blood drain from his face. The boss of bosses, the head of the Montgomerys. The overarching leader of the Montgomery Empire was an elusive figure known in the underworld only as the Architect. No one knew his real name. No one knew his face. He was a phantom who moved billions of dollars and commanded armies of politicians. "Yes," Matteo said grimly. "Arthur said we are cut off. Not just the docks. Everything. Any family that does business with the Rossis will be systematically dismantled by the Montgomerys. The Costellos and the Ivanovs have already pulled out of our alliances. We are entirely isolated, Lorenzo. We have maybe a week before we go bankrupt, and 2 weeks before our enemies realize we're defenseless and slaughter us." Lorenzo paced the room, his mind racing. This was impossible. He had been a loyal earner for the Montgomery infrastructure. Why? Why would the Architect do this? We've been perfect partners. Arthur wouldn't say. He just said you offended the bloodline. You insulted the crown. Lorenzo frantically mentally rewound the past few months. Who had he killed? Who had he extorted? No one connected to the Montgomerys. He was too smart for that. "Set up a meeting," Lorenzo ordered, his voice tight. "Whatever it takes. Pay Arthur $1 million just to make the phone call. I need a sit-down with the Architect. I will apologize. I will pay double tribute for a year. Just get me in the room." It took 24 agonizing hours. During that time, Lorenzo lost another 3 warehouses to mysterious fires, and his top enforcer was arrested on a decades-old cold case that miraculously found new evidence. The noose was tightening with terrifying efficiency. Finally, Matteo brought the news. "Tonight, 9 p.m., the penthouse of the Montgomery Tower downtown. Arthur says the Architect will grant you exactly 5 minutes to plead your case." Lorenzo dressed with meticulous care. He wore a stark black suit, devoid of his usual flashy jewelry. He was going as a supplicant, a beggar facing a king. He told Matteo and Vincent to wait in the SUV downstairs. He had to do this alone. The Montgomery Tower was a monolith of black glass and steel that dominated the Chicago skyline. The private elevator shot Lorenzo up to the 81st floor in silence. When the polished doors slid open, he stepped into a space that redefined wealth. It wasn't an office. It was a sanctuary of power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the city. The floors were rare black marble. At the far end of the cavernous room was a massive desk carved from a single slab of petrified wood. The high-backed leather chair behind the desk was turned away from him, facing the sprawling, glittering lights of Chicago. Lorenzo walked forward slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from the desk, clearing his throat. Sir Lorenzo began his voice, devoid of its usual arrogant rasp, replaced entirely by submissive respect. "I am Lorenzo Rossi. I want to thank you for granting me this audience. I do not know how I have offended the Montgomery family, but I swear on my life it was unintentional. I am here to make amends, whatever the price the Rossi family will pay it." Silence stretched in the massive room. The hum of the city below felt 1,000,000 miles away. Then the heavy leather chair slowly began to swivel around. "The price, Mr. Rossi," a smooth, chillingly familiar female voice echoed in the cavernous room, "is everything you own." Lorenzo's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened in absolute shock as the chair turned, completely revealing the person sitting behind the desk. It was her, the heavy-set woman from the Sapphire Ball. She wasn't wearing an emerald gown tonight. She was dressed in a tailored, impeccably sharp black silk suit that commanded total authority. Her dark hair was down, framing her face in severe waves. The soft, gentle demeanor she had initially displayed at the gala was entirely gone, replaced by an aura of absolute, crushing dominance. She sat back in the chair, her hands folded neatly on the petrified wood desk, looking at him with eyes as cold as a frozen ocean. "You," Lorenzo choked out his mind, fracturing as it desperately tried to connect the pieces. The woman he had called a waddling liability. The woman he had publicly mocked for her weight. Charlotte Montgomery. She introduced herself softly, a razor-thin smile playing on her lips. Or, as your middleman prefers to call me, the architect. Lorenzo felt his knees actually buckle. He reached out to a nearby chair to steady himself, the blood rushing in his ears. The terrifying realization crashed down on him like a collapsing building. The woman he had humiliated for sport was the supreme ruler of the Chicago underworld. "I told you," Charlotte whispered, her voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel, "that a stain on your judgment was permanent." "You," Lorenzo stammered, the polished veneer of the Mafia boss completely shattering. "You are the architect, the Montgomery family. You run it." "I do not merely run it, Lorenzo," Charlotte said, her voice a soft, echoing hum in the cavernous office. "I am it. My grandfather built the foundation. My father expanded the walls, and I installed the locks. I control the ports, the politicians, the police, and the supply chains that allow little men like you to play dress-up and pretend to be gangsters." Lorenzo's mind scrambled for a lifeline. He was a survivor. He had clawed his way to the top of the Rossi syndicate through cunning and brutality. There had to be a way to negotiate, a way to charm or buy his way out of this apocalyptic miscalculation. "Ms. Montgomery." Lorenzo began forcing his posture straight, though his hands trembled slightly. He tried to summon his most persuasive diplomatic tone. "I made a grave error in judgment at the Sapphire Ball. I was arrogant. I was out of line. I deeply apologize for the disrespect I showed you. But surely crippling an entire syndicate, disrupting the flow of capital in the city. Isn't this an overreaction over a spilled glass of wine and a few careless words?" Charlotte let out a low, humorless laugh that sent a fresh wave of ice down his spine. She slowly pushed a thick leather-bound folder across the expanse of her petrified wood desk. "You think this is about my feelings, Lorenzo?" She asked, her tone shifting from mock amusement to dead seriousness. "You think I dismantled your empire because my feelings were hurt?" She stood up. She did not hide her heavy-set frame. Instead, she commanded the space around her. Her presence was monolithic. "I am a fat woman in a world run by vicious, superficial men," Charlotte stated plainly, pacing slowly behind her desk. "Do you honestly believe you are the first arrogant prick to hurl an insult at me? If I burned down the livelihood of every man who called me a cow behind my back, Chicago would be nothing but ash. No, Lorenzo. Your insult at the gala was merely a diagnostic test, and you failed it spectacularly." Lorenzo frowned, confusion battling with his panic. "A test. My syndicate relies on discipline, discretion, and emotional control," Charlotte explained, stopping to look out the floor-to-ceiling window at the glittering city below. "We are facing a federal crackdown next year. I need my network to be bulletproof. I need the street bosses to be pragmatic, calculating, and above petty emotional outbursts. When I bumped into you, I wanted to see how the great Lorenzo Rossi handled a minor, unexpected inconvenience." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with cold contempt. "Instead of handling it quietly, you threw a public tantrum. You drew unnecessary attention to yourself and your associates. You chose cruelty over control, vanity over discretion. You revealed that your ego is your fatal weakness. A man who cannot control his temper over a splashed lapel cannot be trusted with $20 million in smuggled assets. You are a liability, Lorenzo. I didn't destroy you because you insulted my weight. I destroyed you because your reaction proved you are fundamentally unfit to lead. The words hit Lorenzo like physical blows. She hadn't just beaten him financially. She had diagnosed his deepest psychological flaw and used it to erase him. I can change, Lorenzo pleaded, desperation bleeding into his voice. The realization that he was totally outmatched had finally settled in. I can be discreet. You hold the leash, Ms. Montgomery. Just give me back my docs. Let me earn for you. You have nothing left to earn with, Charlotte replied calmly. She tapped the leather folder on her desk. Inside this folder are the deeds to your remaining warehouses, the titles to your legal fronts, and the transfer codes for whatever offshore accounts my hackers haven't already drained. You are going to sign them all over to the Montgomery conglomerate tonight. And if I refuse, Lorenzo asked, a flicker of his old defiance flaring in his chest. I still have men. I still have soldiers on the street who are loyal to the Rossi name. Charlotte smiled, a terrifying, predatory curling of her lips. She pressed a silver button on her desk intercom. You can come in now, she said. The heavy oak doors at the back of the office opened. Lorenzo turned, expecting to see Montgomery enforcers coming to execute him. Instead, a familiar figure walked into the room. It was Matteo. Lorenzo's breath hitched. Matteo, what are you doing here? Did they capture you downstairs? Matteo didn't look at Lorenzo. He kept his eyes fixed respectfully on Charlotte. He walked past his former boss and stood at attention beside her desk. Matteo has been on my payroll for the last 6 months, Charlotte revealed casually. He is pragmatic. He saw that your vanity was going to sink the ship eventually. When I gave the order to quarantine your syndicate, it was Matteo who handed over your offshore account numbers. It was Matteo who provided the manifests for the seized cargo containers. You traitor! Lorenzo roared, lunging toward his former underboss. Before Lorenzo could take 2 steps, Matteo drew a suppressed pistol from his jacket and aimed it squarely at Lorenzo's chest. The click of the safety being disengaged echoed loudly in the silent room. Lorenzo froze, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It's just business, Lorenzo, Matteo said quietly, his expression unreadable. You wanted to be a star. The Montgomerys want to be invisible. I chose the winning team. Lorenzo was entirely broken. He had no money, no empire, and no loyal men. He was standing in a bespoke suit that he could no longer afford to dry clean, facing a woman who possessed the kind of absolute power he had only dreamed of. Sign the papers, Lorenzo. Charlotte commanded her voice, brooking no argument. Sign over the ashes of your empire. If you do, I will allow you to live. But you will no longer be a boss. You will no longer wear designer suits and terrorize aldermen. You will work for me directly in a capacity of my choosing. Your life, your breath, your future. They belong to the Montgomery family now. Trembling, stripped of all pride and ego, Lorenzo Rossi walked to the petrified wood desk. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. With a shaking hand, he signed his name, transferring everything he had built to the woman he had publicly shamed just 3 days prior. When he finished, he dropped the pen. He looked at Charlotte, his eyes hollow. What happens to me now? Now, Charlotte murmured, looking over the signed documents with quiet satisfaction. Now you learn how to serve. 6 months passed. The Chicago underworld adjusted rapidly to the absolute absorption of the Rossi syndicate. On the streets, rumors swirled that Lorenzo Rossi had been killed, his body dumped in Lake Michigan. Others whispered that he had fled to Europe in disgrace. The truth was far more humiliating and infinitely more complex. It was a freezing November evening. The Chicago elite were gathered at the Symphony Hall for another high society gala. Outside, a sleek, armored black Maybach idled smoothly by the curb. Standing beside the rear door, unflinching in the icy wind, was Lorenzo. He was no longer dressed in midnight blue Brioni. He wore a simple, unbranded black suit and a heavy wool overcoat. An earpiece rested in his right ear. His posture was rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter for threats. He was the head of Charlotte Montgomery's personal security detail. Her driver, her shadow, her property. The symphony doors opened, and Charlotte emerged. She wore a stunning crimson coat over a black evening gown, her dark hair swept to the side. She moved with that same deliberate, commanding grace that Lorenzo had once mocked. As she approached the car, a rival shipping magnate, a tall, arrogant man named Harrington, stepped into her path, slightly inebriated and clearly looking to assert dominance. "Charlotte," Harrington slurred, blocking her way. "I see you swallowed up the Rossi territory. Tell me, how does a woman of your substantial proportions manage to balance so much on her plate? Don't you worry about your heart giving out under all that weight?" 6 months ago, Lorenzo would have laughed alongside the man. Now a surge of dark, violent protectiveness flared in his chest. Before Charlotte could even blink, Lorenzo moved. He stepped between Charlotte and the magnate with terrifying speed. He grabbed Harrington by the lapels of his tuxedo, violently slamming the man back against a concrete pillar. The impact knocked the wind out of the billionaire in a loud wheeze. Lorenzo leaned in his forearm, pressed against the man's throat, his eyes dead and cold. "The lady's health is pristine," Lorenzo whispered viciously into Harrington's ear. "Yours, however, is about to take a severe turn if you do not apologize to Ms. Montgomery and walk away immediately." Harrington gasped, his eyes wide with sudden terror as he recognized the face of the former Mafia boss, now acting as an attack dog. "Rossi, you're alive." "What?" "Apologize," Lorenzo commanded, applying slightly more pressure to the windpipe. "I apologize. I'm sorry, Charlotte." Harrington choked out his face, turning a blotchy red. Lorenzo abruptly released him. The magnate stumbled away, adjusting his coat and fleeing down the frozen sidewalk. Lorenzo turned back to Charlotte, smoothing down his own coat, his breathing entirely steady. He opened the rear door of the Maybach for her. "That was unnecessary, Lorenzo," Charlotte said quietly, though there was a glint of something unreadable in her dark eyes. "I can handle Harrington." "No one disrespects the architect," Lorenzo replied, his voice a low gravel. It wasn't just a line. He meant it. Over the last 6 months, Lorenzo had been dragged through hell. Charlotte had forced him to work the docks to negotiate with low-level thugs to stand silently in the corner while she orchestrated billion-dollar deals. She stripped away his vanity and forced him to watch real power at work. And in that brutal crucible, something twisted and profound had happened to him. His hatred for her had burned away, replaced by an intoxicating, obsessive reverence. He had watched her outsmart cartels, outmaneuver federal agents, and dominate rooms filled with men who underestimated her solely based on her appearance. He realized now how utterly blind he had been. She was a leviathan. She was brilliant, ruthless, and strangely majestic. The soft, heavy curves he had once shamed were now symbols of the absolute, unyielding space she commanded in his world. He didn't just fear her anymore, he worshipped her. Charlotte stepped into the warmth of the Maybach. Lorenzo closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the wheel. He locked the doors and started the partition, sealing them in the quiet luxury of the cabin. "You've changed, Lorenzo," Charlotte murmured from the back seat, watching him through the rearview mirror. The man who spilled wine on his suit at the Sapphire Ball would have joined Harrington in his jokes. Lorenzo met her gaze in the mirror. That man was an idiot. He was blind to what true power looks like. And what does true power look like? She asked softly. It looks exactly like you, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a dark, devoted murmur. I own nothing. I am nothing without your permission. And I have never felt more dangerous than I do right now, serving you. Charlotte held his gaze for a long moment, the silence in the car thick with a heavy magnetic tension that had been slowly building between them for months. The dynamic of captor and captive boss and servant was beginning to blur into a dark, twisted romance forged in humiliation and absolute submission. Drive Lorenzo, Charlotte finally whispered, a faint, victorious smile touching her lips. Yes, boss, Lorenzo replied. He put the car in gear, slipping seamlessly into the dark Chicago night, entirely consumed by the woman who had broken him, only to reshape him into something far deadlier. Did you love this story of ultimate karma and dark mafia romance? There is nothing more satisfying than watching an arrogant boss get a brutal reality check, only to fall deeply in love with the powerful woman who destroyed his ego. If you want more dramatic, plot-twisting stories of revenge, power dynamics, and unexpected romance, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for daily storytelling content.